Good morning. My name is Dave. For those who don't know me, I want to especially make sure to say hi to everyone on Zoom that is attending this morning. As Nate mentioned, we're continuing our series on perspectives, priorities, and possessions. Looks like 1 second. Let's see if I can improve this. Gets a little too close to my mouth. Try that and see if that's better. We're continuing on our series on perspectives, priorities, and possessions. Nate and Luis spoke the last 2 weeks on this topic, helping us understand better how we should look at our resources. And this week we're going to specifically be looking at how we can be good stewards of our finances and put that into practice. So that will be our focus this morning. Now, in Christ Church, we have a lot of different cultures represented here. And one of the most difficult things in learning a foreign language is understanding their expressions or their idioms. And so this morning, I wanted to mention some of the different ways of speaking of people who don't like to spend money. Some of the words that I've come across are stingy, cheapskate, tightwad, penny pincher. Now, those are some of the expressions from the United States, but in Argentina and I think also in Uruguay, I appreciate the saying codo or elbow duro, elbow. I just mixed languages. Elbow, hard elbow, or elbow of gold. Now, what's interesting about these expressions is where they came from. And so I went to a very reliable source, the internet, to try to find out where did this expression come, hard elbow, to express the idea of somebody that doesn't like to spend money. And so I found two theories on where this expression came from. One theory is that a person is so cheap that they only walk on their elbows so they won't wear out their shoes. That's one theory. And then I found another theory about the same expression, that a long time ago, shepherds, when they went to sell their sheep, they would receive their money and they would put it in a bag underneath their arm like this. And as they would travel home, they would have to close tightly with their elbow, their hard elbow or their elbow of gold, so that thieves wouldn't come and steal their bag and no one would see that they were carrying a big bag of money. Now, you can decide which theory you think is the best theory, and later you can tell me afterwards, what's the true story about the origin of that saying. But it's interesting to look at our expressions. Not only do we have expressions for people that don't like to spend money, we also have expressions for people that love to spend money. Some of those expressions that I know about are big spender, high roller, living high on the hog, which I'm not going to try to explain that expression and where that came from. And my favorite in Spanish, they're throwing the house out the window. And once again, I haven't researched where that came from, but that's a common expression, at least in Argentina. The Uruguayans might tell me that that's not as common here, but throwing the house out the window is one way of expressing the idea of spending all the money for a party or for some purpose. Now, while we can laugh about the extremes of spending, the real question is, how can we be responsible and generous with our resources? What should we do practically? And then how should we view them, and how should we manage our resources well? What we do with our finances demonstrates what we have in our hearts. And if we want to be generous people, we should demonstrate generosity with our finances and our other resources. The truth is, it's possible to have very little and still be greedy. But it's also possible to have great wealth and to be very generous. But the opposite can be true. A person can have very little and they can be incredibly generous. I know many people like this. And you can be very wealthy and have an overabundance of wealth and be greedy and self-centered. So it doesn't depend on the amount of resources that we have. It's not about the amount of money in your pocket. It's about the amount of love that you have in your heart. So today we will look at different principles that can guide us as we seek to give generously to God and generously to others. Generosity, love, kindness, and faith are just some of the right motives to give. Now, I want to go back to the text that Roshina read for us from the Bible and just read one portion of that text one more time. Now, in the letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian church in this chapter 9, Paul is recognizing the great generosity of the Corinthian church, but he's also giving them some guidelines on giving. He's reminding them of what it means to give generously. And the Corinthian church was helping support Paul's work to spread the message of Jesus throughout the ancient world, but the church was also helping the poor and people in need. So let's read 2 Corinthians 9, 6 through 8. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. So there's several principles about giving in this text, and I'm summarizing those principles with 4. To give generously, to give intentionally or purposefully, to give joyfully, and to give expectantly, or to give with hope, with expectations. Now let's look at how these principles help us answer other questions that we have, other practical questions that we have on giving. First question is, who can give generously? Now, some people have the idea that to be generous, you have to have great wealth, you have to have great resources. But that's not actually true. There's people that do have great wealth, but there's also people that have very little that can also be incredibly generous. People that are religious can be generous, but people that are non-religious can be generous. And in the Bible, we have many examples of people being generous. 2 examples are very, very interesting that can both be found in the Gospel of Luke. The 2 examples are the poor widow and the rich tax collector. Now, regarding the widow, Nate shared this story 2 weeks ago. In the temple, in the Jewish temple during Jesus' time, there was a widow that she was very poor. She had 2 coins. And with those 2 coins that she had, she decided that she wanted to give those 2 coins to her place of worship, to the temple. Now that, for most people, was hardly anything. It was little to nothing. But when Jesus saw her gift, he recognized that she had been incredibly generous, and he made the declaration that she had given more than everyone else, more than the rich people, more than the religious people. She was the one that had given the most, even though it was only 2 coins. So we see that there are times when there are people that maybe have very little and make a great sacrifice from the little that they have to give and to be generous. Now, another interesting case is a case of Zacchaeus. If you know the story of Zacchaeus, he's famous for being a little guy, a short, small person that climbed a tree because he wanted to see Jesus. But the interesting part of Zacchaeus' story is that when he came to know Jesus and came to believe, he expressed a change of his heart and a change of his perspective. See, Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector. He was in charge of all these tax collectors that worked for the Romans and were collecting taxes from the Jewish people, from their own people. And not only would they take the taxes and receive the taxes, they would also take all the money that they could for themselves to make themselves rich. So Zacchaeus had become rich by basically robbing his own people. And for that reason, he wasn't very well liked in his culture. But when Zacchaeus came to know Jesus, his perspective changed. His view of finances changed, and he declared that he would take 4 times what he had stolen, and he would return that money to the people he had stolen from. And not only that, he said that he would take half of all his possessions, and he would give that great wealth to the poor. And when Zacchaeus made this declaration, Jesus made his own, and Jesus stated that salvation had come to the home of Zacchaeus. What had happened was there was a change of heart. What had happened was that Zacchaeus came to have the same heart as that poor widow, and with the wealth that he had, he became incredibly generous. But if we make a comparison, Zacchaeus wasn't more generous than the widow. They were both generous with what they had. And we can see that all people, whether they're wealthy or whether they have little, can give and can be generous. So the second question, what can be given intentionally? If we are to give intentionally from the heart, what can be given? Now, there are many ways to give. While some people have an abundance of financial resources, other people have an abundance of other resources. It might be time. It might be service. It might be they're incredibly talented or creative. They might have great energy, knowledge. They might be able to give their friendship. And most importantly, they can give their love. So that's a very important question. There's some people that maybe have very little that they can give financially, but they're incredibly generous with their time or in their service. They're generous with their relationships, with their friendships. They might be generous with their homes. They might be generous with listening to others, with caring. There are many ways to be generous. And so the question is, what do you have? What do I have that I could give? What has God given me, and how could I be generous with what I've received? So that's one question. What can I give? But the other part is, how much should I give? And this is an important question for the Christian church. Some people look at their income and they say, well, I believe that I should give 10%. Other people say, no, that's way too much. There's no way I could do that. I can give this much. Some might not give any for different reasons. And some have even come to give more than 10% to the point that some very wealthy people, because of their faith, give 90% of their income, which is hard to believe and hard to imagine. But some people have been blessed so much with their finances that they want to give back the majority of it in other ways. In the Bible, as we read in the Bible, before the birth of Christ in the Old Testament, we see that there was a custom of giving 10%, which was called the tithe. 10% of one's finances or 10% of their harvest or their crops, whatever their profession was. And this was done by presenting the tithe to support the religious leaders, to support a place of worship, such as a Jewish temple, and to also help the poor. Now, in the New Testament, this tradition continues in the New Testament of the Bible, and many continue to practice it today in the Christian faith. In the past, it was a religious obligation. And in the New Testament, we see a different attitude. We see a greater emphasis on giving from the heart. As the Apostle Paul stated, according to what one has decided in their heart. Now, in Christ Church, I've had conversations with Nate, with Luis, and with John Hamilton before he went on his trip. And I know that our desire here is to not obligate people to give, to not manipulate, but to encourage people to give according to what they have in their heart. And so that is truly our desire here, is for people to feel that freedom, that they will not be scrutinized, they will not be judged or treated differently according to their generosity. But we do want to encourage that people grow in their generosity and grow in their giving for many reasons, and one of the greatest reasons for the joy that we can find in that. So here we want you to have the confidence that you can have privacy in your giving, that you will not be pressured, and that each person can determine the way that they are being led by God to be generous. Now, personally, I know many people who are unable to give very much financially, just places all over the world. But same people that are constantly giving to their church community, or giving to the greater community, or giving to people in need, people that are always volunteering, and whenever there's a need, they are some of the first people to help to answer that need. They give intentionally, not because of obligation, not because they're trying to achieve something. They give because they love to give and they love to serve. And as we've heard recently, God loves a joyful giver. So that's the second question. What can be given intentionally? The third question is, how can we give expectantly and with joy? Now, the answer to this question partly has to do with the place where we send our resources. Now, there's different ways to give, not only what we can give, but where we give. The destination can be a local church. If someone wants to give back to God, a great place to give is in a local community. This might be your community here at Christ Church, and this is a great place to give because of the work we're doing here. But you might be visiting, and you're part of another community, and you choose to give in that community, and that is great. We encourage that. So the destination to giving can be a local church, but it can also be another Christian ministry. It can also be an institution that's meeting a social need, or you can also even give to God by giving to people in need. Someone that you know, a neighbor, someone in the community, maybe even a stranger, if you feel that is the right place to give. Those are all great ways that we can be generous in ways that honor God and honor other people and show His love. But what's most important is that we should give from our hearts and not because of obligation. And to achieve this type of attitude, it's very important to have confidence in the cause that we're giving to, confidence in the values of a church or an institution, and confidence in what will be done with the contribution. When there's trust, then it's much easier to give joyfully and with expectation. Because when there's trust and you believe in a cause, then you know that what you give is going to make an impact. You know that it might change somebody's life, maybe just for a day. It might help someone, thinking of Christ Church, it might help children come to know God through godly play. A gift might help a project, a generosity project on the weekend that brings food to people's homes. And that's something that Christ Church was involved in yesterday. It might mean sending people to the hospital to give gifts and encourage and to pray with people. It might mean helping promote classes here in Christ Church that help people have spiritual freedom and help people learn what it means to be emotionally healthy spiritually. All those are different ways that giving can help make an impact. Not just with the finances and volunteering and leading, facilitating a group, are all different ways that we can be generous and that we can give. Now, trust is so important that I would even say if you didn't trust a place that you were thinking about giving, that you would wait. You would talk with people to find out what they're doing, what their vision is, how they manage their finances. Because if you have that trust, then you can give joyfully. Then you can give because you've decided in your heart and even honor God in that way. Now, there are places that aren't always trustworthy. I know that there are some churches in the world that use manipulation and shame to motivate people to give. At times, they might even threaten people with God's punishment for not giving. And a place like that is not a happy place to be in. It's really, I would say, almost impossible to be a joyful giver in a place like that. And then there's other places, other churches, where they promise economic prosperity for giving. If you give this much to God, He will give you this much in your finances. Now, I believe in a God that is very generous and that provides, but there's no guarantee that by giving some of my finances that He will make me rich or He will give me even greater wealth. There's no guarantee of that. There's guarantee of other things. So in these types of religious environments, they do not promote giving in joy. They do not promote giving from what you decided, rather by coercion and manipulation. And generally, in places like that, people end up discouraged, disappointed, and disillusioned. So what can we expect from God? If there's no guarantee that He's going to make us wealthy, what can we expect from God if we are generous with our resources? But first of all, we can expect that God will use our contributions to do something good. If we're giving from a generous heart, we can trust that He's going to use that to make an impact. And secondly, we can trust that God is going to not only make an impact in the people around us, we can also trust that God is going to provide for us, that He is watching over us and He knows our needs, and He's going to provide for our greatest needs. And maybe we won't be more blessed financially, but we see blessings in other ways. We see blessings because there's joy in our hearts. We see blessings because we've made new friendships. We see blessings because we don't worry as much as about our finances. We don't worry as much about what's going to happen tomorrow. We're more concerned with how can I give and how can I help this person? How can I help this community grow and more people be a part of it? That's a different type of expectation, but we can trust that God is faithful in that. Now, I wanted to share a story of someone that I know, I would say a friend, much older than I am, retired at this moment. And he is one of the wealthiest people that I know. I have no idea how much wealth that he has, but he is very wealthy. He's worked hard throughout his life, and he's achieved much professionally, and he's achieved a lot economically. But when this person tells his story of his life, it's shocking to find out that when he was a child, his family was so poor that they were homeless and had to live under a bridge at a certain point in his life. And when he told me this story, I was shocked. And when he tells his story, he became a lawyer and a businessman. He says that his secret was that when he started to work, he decided that he was going to give part of his income to God, to his local church. And every year, as he saw that God blessed him and took care of his finances, he gave more and became more generous, at least giving a greater portion, a greater percentage of his income and his resources every year. And if you ask him, he'll say that is a secret of how he was able to be blessed and achieve so much. Now that's an interesting story, and some might think, well, there must be some other reasons. He's also intelligent, and he studied law, and he lives in a place where he benefited from opportunities. But at the same time, in his heart, it was about being generous. And the greatest achievement isn't the money he's made. The greatest achievement is the amount of love and generosity that's in his heart. And I can tell you that he would say the same. And one thing that is true of this friend of mine is that he never abandoned his belief that God was providing for him. Now, the most important thing is not our finances. It's not our resources, but it's what we have in our hearts. That is our great treasure. And some might give because of obligation. They might give to church because they feel like it's an obligation. They feel like that it's something that they must do, or things will go bad in their life. But listen to what Jesus said to religious leaders of his time, to the Pharisees, in Luke 11:42. Here Jesus states, "Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs." So they gave their tithe. "But you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone." Jesus is making it clear. These religious leaders giving by obligation, giving the obligatory tithe, were not pleasing God. They were doing something good in giving, but their hearts weren't full of love. They weren't giving out of love. They weren't seeking justice. They were just seeking to be good and to feel good about themselves. So we can sometimes do the same. We can say, well, I need to give, so I give something. But in our hearts, there's no joy. In our hearts, there's no love. In our hearts, we don't care about justice. We just give so we can feel good about ourselves. And that doesn't honor God. And it doesn't give us that freedom that we need from our own selfishness and our own pride. So in conclusion, this morning, I want to remind us that God doesn't need our resources. God doesn't need our money, but he does want us to learn to be generous, and he wants us to learn to express love through giving. So what's the point of being generous? What's the point of all of this? The point is to give with gratitude to God, finding freedom from worries and materialism. It is discovering how to use our resources to express our love for God and others. It is giving in the hope that we are investing in something much greater than ourselves, much bigger than ourselves, something that God is doing and he wants us to be a part of. And so in closing, I want to just close with a few recommendations on how to be generous. For some people, it might be new. The idea of giving to help somebody else might be a new idea. The idea of figuring out how to be generous might be a new step for you. And so I have these 4 recommendations. So one is to just start to be generous. Look at what you have in your resources and look at how you can give. So just start. Simple. The second recommendation is to ask God in prayer how to give. Sometimes we don't know how we should give. We don't know what we have, or we don't know who's in need, or if we want to give to our church community. And a great place to start is to ask God in prayer, how can I give? Who should I give to? And I am confident that God will lead you to the right place. The third recommendation is to seek freedom, peace, and joy from your finances. And what happens is something very interesting is that when we begin to not be such hard elbows, codos de oro, we start to have more peace. When we begin to give and find joy in giving, we don't care so much about our finances. We see our finances and our resources as tools to help people, tools to be a part of God's mission, as tools to even share love. And that's a very different way of looking at our finances. That brings freedom. That brings peace and joy. And if we want to earn more, we do need, obviously, take care of our personal needs and family, and we have dreams that can all be good things. But as we seek to be generous, and that's a part of our life, we find freedom in that, and we find peace. And the last recommendation is to look and see if God fulfills his promises. I am convinced that God keeps his promises and he keeps his word. And so as we give, and sometimes even sacrifice, there are times when we wonder, is this the right decision? We might even regret giving. And that's why I recommend seeing over time how God provides. If you take a step and you give to somebody in need, or you give to a community, look for ways that God is going to provide for you personally, because he promises to take care of us. As the Apostle Paul said in the beginning of this text that we read, he that sows generously will reap generously. It might not be finances, but God will provide, and he will bring new blessings into your life. I am convinced of that. So this morning I would just encourage all of us to not be so concerned about our finances as much as what's in our heart, and the generosity and the love in our heart.